Hi everyone, welcome. We're talking about the female menstrual cycle this time. So the menstrual cycle is a monthly cycle or process in which the female body releases an egg that could potentially be fertilized to produce a fetus and a baby. Okay. Now there's two real structures in the female body that we're going to focus on, and that is the brain up here. That's kind of what I've showed it in gray. And then we've got the uterus and the vagina and the fallopian tubes attached to the ovary as well. Okay, so those are the two major structures that we're going to focus on. Just as a quick reminder here, you're going to have, this is the lateral view of the female, you're going to have the vagina, which kind of tilts backwards or posterior like that. That connects to the uterus, which then has a nice, a very distinct bend to it, which tilts more anteriorly. That's going to be attached to two fallopian tubes. One is on the left side, the other one on the right side, you can't really see. And then that fallopian tube is then going to attach to the ovary, which I'll draw as a little green dot right about there. So that would be the left ovary that we can see. All right, now this menstrual cycle, where an egg is released each month that could be potentially fertilized, is controlled by a series of hormones. Now these hormones are released by two different organs. Two hormones are going to be released by the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a tiny little gland that lies right in the middle of the brain. So this gray area is the brain. The pituitary gland lies right about there. It's going to be just superior and anterior to the brain stem, which is right there. And the pituitary gland is going to release a couple of different hormones that we'll talk about, which kickstarts the menstrual cycle. And then the other hormones that are released, they're going to be released by the ovaries, which I've drawn as this little green dot. Okay. Now, another thing that's kind of worth mentioning is if we were to kind of zoom in on one of these ovaries, the ovaries is going to look a little bit like this. So let's take this little green dot and we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at it right there. So that's one of the ovaries. These ovaries are going to consist of two different layers. You're going to have the medulla on the middle. That's going to mainly consist of blood vessels, and then the cortex around the periphery. I really focused on the cortex here. This ovary is going to contain a bunch of immature eggs. In fact, when a female is a fetus early on in life, even before birth, there's going to be about 7 million immature eggs in that female fetus. By the time that female is born, that number of immature eggs has been reduced all the way down to about 2 million. And that's because a lot of these immature eggs, or oocytes is what they're really called, they're constantly dying. And they're supposed to die. It's a process called apoptosis, or programmed cell death. So they're constantly dying. So they start out with 7 million just after conception and very early development before birth. By the time the female is born, as a baby, there's down to 2 million. And then by the time that female reaches reproductive age, around 13 or so, that number is down to a couple 100,000, like 200,000 to 300,000. And these immature eggs, all right, I'm going to draw these guys as little blue dots, which are existing inside this ovary. I'm obviously not going to draw 200,000. I'm just going to draw, right, smaller number of these guys. But what I want you to notice is that each little blue dot or egg is going to be surrounded by this red tissue, this little ball of red tissue. This little ball of red tissue is called a follicle. And it's a collection of cells that really works like a team for each immature egg or oocyte. So each oocyte is surrounded by this collection of cells that makes up the follicle. And the follicle really helps that egg develop and mature, and this follicle really is going to help produce these, or is going to be the one that produces these hormones that are ultimately released by the ovary. Okay? So at any given time, you're going to have all these follicles that are developing. And in order for an immature egg to be released during ovulation, this follicle has to develop really large, to about that size, before it eventually is going to protrude from the wall of the ovary, just like this, and it's going to release that egg outside of the ovary, where it's going to be captured by the oviduct, and it's going to hopefully be fertilized. But in order for that egg, this little blue dot right here, this immature egg, to be released, this follicle has to develop. And it's going to take about 100 days, about 3 months, for a follicle to go from being completely immature, like this tiny little red speck, to this size where ovulation occurs. And at any given month during the menstrual cycle, let's say that a female is during a particular month of the menstrual cycle, you're going to have about 20 of these follicles developing at the same time. 20 eggs aren't going to be released. That's because right before ovulation, one of the 20 follicles that are developing, they're going to become a lot more dominant, and they're going to take over, and only one of the eggs is going to be released only from that dominant follicle. The rest of the follicles and those eggs, those guys are going to they're going to die, right? They're going to kind of fall apart and die. That's a process called atresia. Okay, so bunch of follicles, bunch of eggs in the ovary. They're all different stages of development because it takes like 100 days for these guys to fully develop. And one dominant follicle is going to release its egg during ovulation for each month. And that's kind of how it works. All right. After this follicle releases the egg, it becomes a completely different structure. That completely different structure is called the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. And after this follicle releases the egg, it's going to become this little structure that kind of looks like this. Right? That's the yellow body, or the corpus luteum. And that's going to have another important role in releasing hormones that we'll talk about here in a little bit. All right. Good deal. So let's kind of transition a little bit and talk about the sequence of events that controls this very specific cycle of hormones and events in the menstrual cycle. First, we're going to talk about the hormones that are released by that pituitary gland in the brain. So let me label a little bit of this stuff. So the pituitary gland is situated right here. This is the pituitary gland. Is situated right there, is that red dot, right in the middle of the brain. And that pituitary gland is going to secrete two different really important hormones. The first is going to be called follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so I'm going to abbreviate that FSH. All right, so to kickstart the menstrual cycle, what's going to happen is this pituitary gland starts releasing follicle stimulating hormone. And the follicle it's stimulating, this is not your hair follicle, this is the follicle of the ovary, right? This is the follicle that's going to nourish that egg. So here I've drawn a series of graphs. On the y-axis of this first graph up here, this is going to be the concentration of FSH in the blood. And we're going to track it from day 0 all the way up to 28, with 14 being right in the middle. That's because the typical female menstrual cycle is 28 days long, but there's a lot of variation between women. I mean, it's not uncommon for a female to have a menstrual cycle that can last anywhere from 18 days, all the way up to 35 or even 40 days. So the average is 28 days, but there is quite a bit of variation in that between individual females. So the first thing that happens is this pituitary gland starts releasing FSH. That causes the concentration of FSH in the blood to increase and go up. Okay? Well, with a name like follicle stimulating hormone, that hormone is going to cause those 20 or so follicles in the ovary to develop and grow larger, right? So the 20 or so follicles that have been chosen by whatever process, right, they're going to start growing larger and larger. This is a picture of what those 20 follicles look like, right? At first, they're going to be pretty small, and they're just going to be a collection of cells, right, that are going to house one egg. And I'll draw that egg in blue because that was kind of the choice that we made. Those follicles are going to get larger and larger and they're going to be made up of several layers of cuboidal cells, and eventually they're even going to have a fluid-filled cavity in it called the antrum. And they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and what's causing them to get bigger is this follicle-stimulating hormone. So it tells those 20 chosen special follicles to get larger and larger and larger. Okay? Good. And so you're going to have this immature egg right here. Perfect. Now, it's worth mentioning that this egg is really not an egg yet. It's called an oocyte. So let me label that. So this is an oocyte. That's because it's an immature egg that is stuck in meiosis 1. Okay, and so meiosis occurs very early on in a female's life. It starts right as a fetus, but it stops right at meiosis 1. So this is an immature egg that's stuck in meiosis 1. This red tissue around it consists of all these supporting cells. Again, that's the follicle, which is right there. Okay, the follicle-stimulating hormone causes this guy to grow bigger and bigger. Well, while this guy is growing, these cells of the follicle, they're going to start secreting another hormone. And that's one of the ovarian hormones. The first hormone that gets secreted is going to be estrogen. Okay? So if I were to come back over here, this ovary is going to secrete 2 different hormones. It's going to secrete estrogen, which I'm going to color code in this pink color. So on this graph over here, we're going to monitor the concentration of estrogen in the blood. So as the follicle grows bigger and bigger, it's going to secrete more and more estrogen. Right? Bigger follicle, more and more estrogen. Great. Well, when estrogen reaches a peak, which is right around like right before day 14, see how it reaches this peak about halfway through the cycle? That's going to cause the pituitary gland to release another hormone. That second hormone that's released by the pituitary gland is called luteinizing hormone, and that's abbreviated LH. Okay, so then this peak in estrogen causes LH to be released. We're going to draw the concentration of LH on this graph over here. So you're going to get a spike in LH right around day 14 because it was caused by that peak in estrogen. Well, LH causes something really special to happen. That's going to cause the dominant follicle, remember out of the 20 or so follicles, only one becomes dominant. It's going to cause that dominant follicle to release the egg outside of the ovary. It's almost like a zit on the surface of that ovary. So you're going to have this dominant follicle right here. It's going to migrate to the edge of the ovary, and it's going to release that egg directly outside of the ovary. By now, the egg, it's going to continue undergoing meiosis, but that meiosis is going to stop right in meiosis 2. So again, it's not 100% an egg yet. It's still an immature egg, but it is further progressed through meiosis. So now you're going to have this oocyte, which is released outside of the ovary. That gets captured by the fallopian tube, and then that hopefully is where fertilization will occur. For the purposes of this kind of lecture, we're going to assume that fertilization does not occur, and so there's going to be no fertilized egg. So this guy gets released. Now, after this guy gets released, this spike in LH is also going to cause this follicle to become a completely different structure. And that's this yellow structure, which I've drawn right here. This yellow structure is now called the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. So this is the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. And you can see there's a yellow body right there, and here's another one right there, right? Those are the bits of the follicle that are left over. Well, the corpus luteum is going to be responsible for secreting a completely different ovarian hormone. The hormone that this corpus luteum is going to secrete is called progesterone. So that's the second hormone that's secreted by the ovary, specifically progester, the yellow body. So then this is going to cause progesterone to kind of go up in concentration. But then if fertilization doesn't occur in the egg, which is the case here, that yellow body is going to start falling apart and it's going to start dying. So it's going to get smaller. As it gets smaller, it's going to produce less and less progesterone until progesterone levels are ultimately going to drop like that. Now, progesterone has a really important role in the body. This progesterone does a couple of different things. Number one, it's going to inhibit the release of follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland. Well, if this egg does become fertilized, the yellow body is going to hang around, continue to develop, and continue to develop. And so it's going to continue to release progesterone. Progesterone is released in high quantities during early pregnancy. That's going to prevent follicle-stimulating hormone to be released so that the ovaries don't undergo another cycle. They don't need to if fertilization occurred. There's a baby growing in the uterus, or in the uterus by this stage. However, in this situation, the egg was not fertilized. So if the egg's not fertilized, the corpus luteum releases progesterone for a couple of days, but then he starts to fall apart. And then progesterone levels fall down. So this is progesterone. Once the hormone levels fall back down to zero, that is going to allow the pituitary gland to release more FSH, and the cycle starts over. Okay. If we were to follow what estrogen occurs to estrogen, the corpus luteum is going to release a little bit of estrogen, but not too much, so estrogen is going to go down. Really what we've drawn is two different stages of the menstrual cycle. Before ovulation occurs, right here, so this is ovulation, when that follicle releases the egg around day 14. This part of the menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. Follicular phase. And then after ovulation, when that yellow body is releasing progesterone, that's called the luteal phase. Luteal phase. All right, and again, there's a lot of variation in how long this follicular phase can be. Typically, it's about 14 days long, but that's not always the case. Another thing that these ovarian hormones are going to do, specifically progesterone, is it's going to cause the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, to thicken. And it needs to thicken so that it can nourish and handle that fertilized egg, because that's where implantation occurs. Right after the egg's fertilized in the fallopian tube, it's going to implant in the uterus, and that endometrium needs to be nice and thick so it can nourish that implanted fetus. So these ovarian hormones, specifically progesterone, is going to cause that endometrium of the uterus to get thicker and thicker. So this graph is the thickness of the endometrium. And really, that's just another word for the lining of the uterus. Okay. Now, remember, in this case, fertilization didn't occur. So when progesterone drops down to zero, and so does estrogen, that tells the uterus that there's no fertilized egg, there's no baby. And the last thing we need is this thick endometrium, so that's going to cause menstruation to occur. And it's going to occur right after day 28. We're going to skip over here, and we're going to show that the endometrium of the uterus goes way down during this process of menstruation. If there was a fertilized egg, progesterone would stay high, and then the endometrium of the uterus would stay thick, because progesterone would maintain that thickness. That's important so the baby can develop. But in this case, the egg was not fertilized, progesterone drops, estrogen drops, which will cause the thickness of the uterus, the endometrium, to drop, and this process is called menstruation. When that uterine lining is shed outside of the female reproductive system. Okay. Now, so that's kind of an overview of how all this works. One important thing is kind of birth control pills. Birth control pills are a nifty little way in which this cycle is disrupted. So birth control pills, basically what they are is just pills that are made of progesterone. If you guys remember, progesterone has two different functions. It causes the lining of the uterus to thicken, but it also inhibits the release of FSH. If a female takes pills of progesterone during the follicular phase, it's going to inhibit the release of FSH. So let's say you're taking progesterone during this follicular phase. That's going to prevent FSH from being released. If FSH is not released, the follicles will not develop. And if the follicles don't develop, then you're not going to have an egg that is released during ovulation. All right? And that's really how we figured that out. We discovered this is actually a species of baboon that would always eat this one berry that would fruit during a specific time of the year. And during that time of the year, scientists noticed that these guys would never conceive offspring. Well, it turns out that the berries that were only fruiting or only available during a couple months out of the year had a huge amount of progesterone in them. When the monkeys ate those berries that contained progesterone, that kept their progesterone levels high, that prevented FSH from being released, prevented the follicles from developing, which prevented ovulation and prevented, obviously, conception. Okay. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that even in humans, there's such variation in the timing and the duration of not only this whole menstrual cycle and the timing of ovulation, that conception has been known to occur at every single day of the menstrual cycle, day 0 through 28. It's obviously a little bit more likely to occur around halfway through because that's when ovulation is much more likely. But due to the variation in the timing and the duration of the follicular phase, the whole cycle itself, one month it might be 28 days, the other month it might be 34 for a single woman. In addition to the fact that sperm can be housed and kind of stored inside the female womb through these cervical crypts. We talked about that last time. In addition, the female egg, after it's released into the fallopian tubes, it can hang around for a day or two. So there's just so many factors which can influence the exact timing of conception, which means that a baby can be fertilized basically anytime throughout the cycle. Much more likely around day 14 though. All right, I think that's about it. One other thing I wanted to mention is that throughout a female's reproductive life, from age around 13 to 45 or 50, once all of these eggs have been kind of released, that's when the female undergoes menopause. And that's when the menstrual cycle stops because there's no more viable eggs. Once a female reaches kind of the end of her reproductive time, the ovary, the surface of the ovary is going to be all scarred and pitted because of all of these follicles which have ruptured the surface in order to release those eggs. Okay, typical female is going to release a couple hundred eggs throughout her life. Okay, so that is about it. Thanks.